Brenda Fennekin is an MS, LGC, and is a licensed genetic counselor and the Associate Director and Professor at the Autism and Developmental Medicine Institute at the Geisinger Health System in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Her clinical and research activities have focused on genetic causes of neural development disorders, including Dup15q syndrome. Mrs. Fennekin is widely published and has been in a leadership role in professional and advocacy organizations throughout her career, including a term as president of the National Society of Genetic Counselors. Ms. Fennekin was also a co-founder of IDEAS, the Isodicentric Exchange Advisory and Support Group, which subsequently became the Dup15q Alliance. Great stuff. So with no more ado, Brenda, thank you.
Hello, and as one of, what he didn't mention is that when we founded the IDEAS, it was many, many years ago. Actually, we had our first IDEAS conference in 2000, and the group was founded in 1994. So it's amazing to see some of the same families coming back with their adult sons and daughters after all these years. So I'm going to focus today, as was said, on different types of diagnoses that people get over the course of entering this world of Dup15. And what they mean and how they all kind of fit together. And, I imagine there are parents among you for whom this is a relatively new diagnosis, and you may still be in a somewhat shell-shocked state and trying to figure out how all these pieces fit together. And so, I'll be really sort of open about the different types of diagnoses that are out there and to try to demystify what some of these things mean. What does intellectual disability mean? What does autism mean? And how does that fit in when you've got Dup15q. So just as way of disclosure, I work for Geisinger Health System, and I'm also on the board of directors for the National Fragile X Foundation. I'm a consultant for LabCorp and Ovid Therapeutics. And in case you're wondering, because people ask, what is Geisinger Health System? It is actually the largest rural health system in the United States. Interestingly enough, for many years I was working in the Philadelphia area. Now I'm about 3 hours west. And really, nobody knows Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. It's really out in the middle of the state. But the one claim to fame here is that it's about 30 minutes south of Williamsport, Pennsylvania, which is the home of the Little League World Series. So every year we get lots of Little League baseball players coming down. So I want to talk first and define some terms. Developmental disabilities is, a broad term that's been around for a number of years, and there are a lot of terms that kind of come and go and get used interchangeably. So I want to define some vocabulary here. Every single one of the kids in this slide has a genetic disorder. There are all these different genetic disorders represented here, and yet all of them can be said to have a developmental disability. Some of them have cerebral palsy, some of them have intellectual disability, some of them have autism, some of them have a whole host of different things that come under developmental disabilities. So there are other names for DD. They're also known as intellectual and developmental disabilities. Lately, the term neurodevelopmental disorders has become popular, so you see that's all interchangeable. Neurodevelopmental disorders refers to just the brain aspect. We're starting to say, these are conditions that affect the brain, and they come out in many different ways. And so here's a definition fairly recently from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that developmental disabilities are a group of conditions due to some impairments in physical, learning, language, or behavior areas, or all of the above. And they can happen during the developmental period, which is thought to be about up to age around 18 when the brain is developing, and that's the developmental period. They impact day-to-day functioning, and they usually last a person's lifetime. And if you use this definition, 1 in every 6 kids has a developmental disability. Of course, this includes things like ADHD. It can include things like congenital hearing loss, so it's very broad, right? But 1 in 6 kids is an awful lot of individuals in the population. So here's some examples of developmental disabilities: intellectual disability, or ID, autism, CP, specific language impairment, attention deficit disorder, learning disability, and the list goes on and on. There's many, many things that would come under this heading. And so, for example, and I'll go into more detail about what intellectual disability actually means, but one definition is that it's characterized by 3 different areas: problems in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. So not just where you score on an IQ test, but how you're able to independently navigate your environment. And they have to happen before the age of 18, so during the developmental period. And about 1 out of every 91 kids in the United States has an intellectual disability. Intellectual disability is that thing we used to call mental retardation years ago until it was formally changed in 2009. Autism has many different definitions. There are specific criteria for this, but it's a disorder of brain development. And what it's really characterized by are difficulties with social interaction, verbal and nonverbal communication, and some repetitive behaviors like hand flapping or spinning or those sorts of things. And 1 in 68 kids has ASD. You may know this number because every 2 years the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention comes out with a new prevalence estimate, and very often the media, rings the alarm bells that there's an epidemic of autism. And, the bottom line is, yes, the percentage of kids with autism has increased in the past few decades, but what they never tell you is that the prevalence of individuals with intellectual disability has actually gone down dramatically. And there's a lot of diagnostic swapping going on, right? So kids today might get an ASD diagnosis, whereas in the past they might have gotten a mental retardation diagnosis. There are other factors, and there's no doubt, certainly at the higher end of autism, high-functioning individuals, there is a definite increase that can't be explained. One explanation is that we all went to school with kids who maybe didn't have an IEP or weren't identified but were bullied and had all kinds of issues, and who might have had autism if they were being looked at today, whereas in the past they weren't diagnosed. So there's a lot of reasons for this increasing prevalence, most of which are artificial in a way. They have to do with swapping out diagnoses, different criteria, and now picking up a lot more people. Just a couple of terms. So developmental delay is a term, and it's an eligibility term, really, to identify typically preschool children who should be eligible for some kind of developmental services. So it's an eligibility diagnosis, and typically it's used to say there's a certain percentage that this child's development is behind, so they would qualify for speech services, for example, occupational therapy, early intervention services. We typically don't use developmental delay after the age of 5. I often find myself telling my professional colleagues, please stop referring to a 21-year-old as having developmental delay. If they haven't caught up by then, they're not catching up. Developmental delay turns into something more specific after the age of 5 when it becomes more clear what's going on. Below the age of 5, though, it is important to have the term developmental delay because there are many different reasons for developmental delay, and a percentage of children with developmental delay actually will do catch-up, and they won't really end up with a developmental disability later on. So it's important to have that sort of wiggle room in those early years. Once you're really in school age, if there is going to be a problem, whether it's a specific language impairment or autism or an intellectual disability, it's going to manifest usually by that age, and so then you can come down on a more specific diagnosis. So one thing I'll point out quite a bit today is that ID, ASD, cerebral palsy, they're all symptom constellations. And so we need to be thinking of these as groups of symptoms that go together, and they have many, many different underlying causes. So there are literally thousands of known causes for autism. Thousands at this point of known causes for intellectual disability. And so when you look at those clinical diagnoses, these are symptom constellations. There's nothing wrong with that, but we tend in our society not to realize that. And I think even in education, in the medical profession, sometimes people aren't looking at autism as if it's really a bunch of symptoms that have thousands of different causes. They tend to think of it as one thing. It is absolutely not one thing. And DUP15q is the most common known cause of autism, chromosomal cause of autism, but again, there are thousands of other reasons. Very often, these symptom diagnoses co-occur. So you may have individuals who have ASD who also meet criteria for an intellectual disability or low IQ. And about 50% of the time, that's what happens. And about 40% of individuals with ID can be diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder, such as bipolar disorder or ADHD, or some other kind of brain disorder. And about 40% of individuals who have cerebral palsy also have intellectual disability. So, you know, these categorizations of these symptom diagnoses are a little bit fluid, and as you'll see, it's because we're looking at the outside. We're looking at how the person is manifesting in time. And think of ourselves, you know, over the lifespan, our behavior changes. We develop differently. Hopefully, I don't act the same now as I did when I was 14. And so maybe at 14, I could have been diagnosed with, I don't know, reckless teenager syndrome or something. But like now, I don't really have that anymore, right? So you can get different diagnoses over the lifetime. So what's important is that psychiatric and educational diagnoses are behaviorally defined symptom diagnoses for which there are numerous underlying causes or etiologies. Etiology just means the underlying cause. So why is this important? Why do we even diagnose people? Well, a number of very practical reasons. Reimbursement. If you take your child to a psychiatrist or a developmental pediatrician, let's say, and you're saying he's really, really hyperactive, you know, we really need to think about medications or other interventions for this, that psychiatrist, in order to get paid, needs to have a diagnosis that you can list for that child that justifies the use of medication. So I mean, in a very practical way, diagnoses drive treatment in medical care and in behavioral health. So that's number one. The other one I mentioned already, eligibility for services. You know, you go to a school, and if you don't want to label your child, you don't want testing done, which I've heard sometimes parents say, I don't want, you know, labels. Well, you know what? There has to be a way to figure out what services a child's going to be eligible for. So there's nothing wrong with defining behavior appropriately and saying this really fits under autism and therefore these services are available. Nothing wrong with that at all. Treatment is really important, and you know, a big part of why this group was founded, and which is really going to become more obvious in future for this and other genetic support organizations, is really that we're going to make advances in treatment based on specific underlying causes. That is where the science is going, okay? Autism as a whole, with thousands of different causes, as you can imagine, if a treatment is found for some of the behaviors in autism, it may only affect a very small sliver because the others all have different causes, right? So a much better way to go after the research is to go after specific causes, look at what is the function of genes in the DUP15Q region, and when they're overexpressed, what does that do to the brain? And now we have a much more rational path to trying to figure out diagnoses. Sure, there are best practices in special ed that would be good for any child with an autism spectrum disorder or ID, et cetera, and those are great. But when it comes to targeted treatments, knowing the underlying cause, you may not feel it if you're a parent of a young child right now, but you're in a much better place than parents of kids who have autism of unknown cause or global developmental delay of unknown cause. When you know a cause, that's power because you have science behind it and trying to figure out treatments. So that leads into research, and you know, I've been really pleased with the Alliance's focus and investment on research. We started a few years ago, well, actually it's probably not a few, it's a number of years ago, in bringing our scientific advisory group together and saying, let's have a half-day meeting on the science, right? And then we would get together. Now it's like 2 full days. So right after this meeting, we're going up to UCLA. We have 2 full days. And people are clamoring to come to our meeting. We actually didn't have enough spots for all the scientific presentations. That is great progress. People are really paying attention from all over the world, actually, at DUP15. So these are good reasons to diagnose. So there are, despite the good reasons to diagnose, and despite the fact that we've gotten a little bit better about being able to figure out behavioral diagnoses like autism, ID, et cetera, there's still a tremendous amount of confusion out there for families when they enter a school system or for adults with developmental disabilities out in the world. And for example, here are 3 kids. They've all been diagnosed as having global developmental delay. Again, it's an eligibility diagnosis. It makes you eligible for early intervention services. That's basically all that means. It's not very specific. They also have been diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. So all 3 of these kids, if you're a teacher, you're saying, yeah, they all have delay, they have ASD, and all 3 of these kids in this scenario have epilepsy. They started out with some seizures that are either under control or being treated. So if you're a teacher or a therapist, and these are kids on your caseload or in your classroom, you're going to think, well, these 3 kids clearly all have the same thing. And when you do genetic testing, what you find out is this little girl in the middle has DUP15Q, this boy has Fragile X syndrome, and this little girl has the 22q11 1.2 deletion syndrome. From a genetic counselor's point of view, these are 3 completely unrelated genetic disorders that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. I'm a genetic counselor by training, and I'm looking at these, and these are 3 different groups. In fact, Rick Guidotti was talking this morning about he goes to all these different groups. I go to these groups too, you know, like I'm very involved in the Fragile X group, the 22q group. It's an entirely different set of people, but there's overlap in symptoms. Same thing is true in school age. So here we have 3 kids. They're in a learning support classroom. All of them have been identified as having an intellectual disability, and all 3 of them have been identified as having an anxiety disorder. They're probably anxious because they have way too many diagnoses, right? And if you're a learning support teacher and you're trying to like develop some best practices for the kids in your classroom, you're saying, well, these 3 kids, I looked in their chart, they have the same diagnoses. Well, no, they have the same symptoms, but what they have is Smith-Magenis syndrome, 16p11 1.2 deletion, and Rubinstein's-Taybi syndrome. Again, 3 totally different genetic reasons. So one of the things that is really important as families, but also for professionals to understand, and for you to bring back to your professionals, is that genetic diagnoses and symptom diagnoses are like apples and oranges. When we're talking about genetic diagnoses, DUP15Q, we're talking about etiology, which is the underlying cause. This is the underpinning. So developmental disorders are symptoms for which there are many different causes, and we now know that genetics and medical factors play a role in causing most developmental disorders, and we can say that, period. So I've been in this field for a very long time, and in the past, we didn't have a lot of the diagnostic genetic tools that we have today to be able to say, no doubt, genetics is causing this. And we always said it. I'm a New Yorker. I always said it. But now we actually have the science that has proved it, you know? So it's really actually been great to be able to see where genetics research has taken us in helping us to better understand etiology. Because for a very long time, for parents of older adults, for example, they never got an underlying reason, and they might have been told misinformation, like, oh, it was your fault, or the baby had lack of oxygen. That was kind of a classic description of what was going on with these kids, and that's not true at all. Fortunately for DUP15Q, even the older genetic tests like chromosomal karyotyping were able to pick up isodicentric. So it was one of the earliest ones where we were able to find an extra chromosome.
I'm just wondering, so does that mean that autism is a developmental disorder? Like, how is autism, you consider it then a diagnosis?
So the question was, do we consider autism a developmental disorder? Absolutely. But it's a symptom constellation that's caused. And so if your child has, or if you have autism and you have a DUP15Q syndrome, that means that your genetic diagnosis is causing you to behave in certain ways that meet criteria for autism. So autism is many steps removed from the underlying cause. It's just what you see on the outside. So why does etiology matter? Very much preaching to the choir here. We're all about causes, right? And again, I know it doesn't feel that way when you're a new parent, perhaps, finding out about this diagnosis, but you're lucky to have a diagnosis. A lot of families don't know what the cause is, and so they're so removed from any of the active research that's going on that will eventually provide some help. So there are a number of reasons why knowing the cause matters. And these are not in order of importance necessarily. I'm a genetic counselor by training, and so genetic counseling for families is really important. You know, parents often want to know, am I going to have a second child with this condition? And the vast majority of the time with DUP15Q, this does not run in families. It happens out of the blue, and it's not something that's going to happen again. Well, that's cool. I mean, it's enough to deal with when you have a child who's got a developmental disorder without worrying about, oh, am I going to have a second child, or will this keep running in the family? And typically this doesn't. I work with other groups, such as the Fragile X Foundation, where the chance for it happening again is 50% with each pregnancy. And so there are many families that have 3 and 4 kids affected by the same condition. So I'll be talking about genetics tomorrow specifically. There are some caveats to that, but by and large, DUP15Q does not run in families, generally speaking. We also want to alleviate guilt and misconceptions. You know, how many families are out there and they're wondering, you know, when I was pregnant, I went to the Christmas party and I had a couple of glasses of champagne. Is this what caused it? You know, it's natural for couples to kind of rack their brains. What caused this? I'm here to tell you, it's not because you partied too hard in college. It's got nothing to do with anything you did or didn't do. There is nothing new in the environment going on that's causing DUP15. This has been around as much as we know for, as long as humans have been on Earth. Every species has chromosomal differences. There's no increase in the rate of DUP15 over what it was. You didn't do anything. You didn't know about this, and you couldn't have caused it, and you couldn't have prevented it. And that's facts. Vaccines didn't cause this. This is the way it is.
So I'm wondering, though, as in looking at families of kids with DUP15Q, which I am one, does maternal age have any?
Oh, so that's a great question. The question was, could maternal age be a factor? Not that one has control over maternal age, but there actually was a study done some years ago at looking at maternal age, because there are only a small subset of genetic disorders that are impacted by maternal age. Most are not. The most common one people are familiar with is Down syndrome, right? And Down syndrome involves an extra chromosome. So as it turns out, actually, there is a slightly increased risk due to the DUP15 because it's an extra chromosome. However, the majority of kids with DUP15, just like the majority of kids with Down syndrome, are born to women under 35. So yeah, probably increased, but again, the majority of couples in the population who are having babies are under 35. But as a woman gets older, she has an increased chance for extra chromosomes. So that could be an explanation. I think insights into... Oh.
So I have a little different situation. My son was adopted at birth. His birth mother has since had 2 other children with a different father. Her daughter has Down syndrome and her son has autism. And I would venture to guess, just looking at his facial features, probably a milder form of DUP15.
Yeah, so the question came up as an adoptive mom. She knows a bit about the biological family, and the biological mom with different fathers now has had 3 kids with some disabilities, including one with autism, and maybe there's a possibility. Of course, rarely this can run in families, and it's possible that the biological mom has DUP15Q. And I mean, there must be a reason also why the children were placed for adoption. So you wonder about, I don't know anything about her, but you wonder about functioning, and did she have 3 kids and was unable to take care of them? And yes, once you've got DUP15Q, the chance that it would happen is 50-50. So any person who has DUP15Q could go on, and there's a 50-50 chance that that would get passed on in a future generation. But for parents who don't have DUP15Q, and for most of the time, because this is a condition that significantly impacts people's functioning, and most people with DUP15Q, at least in today's society, are not going on to have children, what we see is that in most families it occurs once out of the blue. But if your children went on to have children, there would be a 50-50 chance. I talked about syndrome-specific support organizations like the DUP15Q and the Targeted Research and Intervention, which is coming. You know, I want you to have that hope. There's a great deal of research going on and a great deal of understanding that's evolving about how the brain works and how certain proteins, when they're overexpressed in DUP15, can cause learning and behavioral differences. So that's important. It helps us to anticipate medical needs and gives us some insights into behavior and learning styles. An example is we know that a lot of individuals with DUP15Q have a lot of anxiety and panic attacks. And, you know, we've heard this over and over again from parents. We're just starting to think about, like, how are we going to measure this and look at it? And, you know, working with a bunch of different syndromes, I don't hear that in the other syndromes. I hear it all the time in DUP15. So it starts when you have enough people together, it starts to allow us to make some very specific observations about behavior and learning. So what happens, and why do we have this divide now about behavioral diagnoses and clinical diagnoses versus genetic diagnoses? Well, in the school setting, and many of you have kids with school-age children, you know, you may go back to your schools and say, I went to this conference, here's a lot of information about DUP15, and they may say, oh, send that down to the nurse's office. That's a medical problem, you know. They don't really put together that that's what's driving the behavior and learning issues. Etiological diagnoses, at least in the US, are often considered irrelevant. I mean, even in this day and age when so many kids are getting genetic diagnoses, special ed is really not focused on those types of diagnoses, and the training, even of great special educators and therapists, has not included any knowledge about genetic conditions. And instead, it's the educational and psychiatric diagnoses that determine services and treatment approaches. I know some of you may flinch when you hear psychiatric. Well, you know, let's call a spade here. Autism is a childhood psychiatric disorder. Psychiatric disorders are behavioral disorders. It sounds so scary, but all it means is something that's diagnosed based on your behaviors and your presentation. That's all it is. There are childhood psychiatric and adult psychiatric disorders. So there's been this divide for many decades over developmental disabilities, and psychiatry's been looking at it in one perspective. From, you know, let's figure out how we can diagnose autism, what are the features of it, just as an example, and also what medications are used to treat attention deficits, what medications are used to treat aggression, etc., anxiety. So that's where psych is coming from. Genetics has been interested in developmental disabilities for many, many decades, even before we had the powerful diagnostic tools we have today, and our interest is always etiology. What's causing this? That's our number one thing. What is causing this? And now we're kind of leading this game because we know a lot of what's causing it. Psychology has been interested in measuring function. So what's the IQ of the individual? What types of behaviors is the person manifesting, and what's driving behavior? And in the school settings, really, psychology is the primary driver of special ed. Measuring IQ, what are best practices in remediation. Unfortunately, until recently, these three disciplines were all looking at developmental disabilities in their own way, and they weren't even talking to each other. Each group was publishing their own literature, doing their own thing, and so psychiatry had its own way of diagnosing things, the clinical or the symptom diagnoses. Genetics was looking at etiology and giving names like DUP15Q. And then psychology was looking at it from a school perspective and what's driving behavior and how can we adapt the school setting. So I want to take a little bit of time to talk about psychiatric diagnoses and, again, demystify this. Psychiatric should not be a scary word. Psychiatric just means a whole group of conditions that are defined in the way they manifest themselves in behavior and their onset. So they're based on observed, recognizable patterns of human behavior. And they're diagnosed using criteria that are in a large manual called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's the 5th edition of the manual, so we call this the DSM-5. If it's a psychiatric diagnosis, it's in that manual. If it's not in the manual, it's not a psychiatric diagnosis. It's a bit artificial, but that's the way it is. Psychiatric diagnoses are described in the manual. If it's not in the manual, it's not a psychiatric diagnosis. So what's really interesting is DUP15Q and no other genetic diagnosis is in the manual because we know what the causes are, right? We don't have to use behavioral criteria to diagnose them. So DUP15Q syndrome is not in the manual, but autism is in the manual. So a kid who's got DUP15Q has a genetic diagnosis and a psychiatric diagnosis. The genetic diagnosis is leading to the behaviors that can be described as the behavioral diagnosis or the psychiatric diagnosis, okay? So these are symptom diagnoses. Every single psychiatric diagnosis is a symptom diagnosis based on what you see on the outside. That's because for decades we had no way of describing these. So when psychiatrists would see kids running around the room, very hyperactive, jumping off chairs, not able to sit still, not able to focus, they came up with criteria and said, every time we see a kid like that, we're going to say, if they meet this criteria, they have ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. If they don't have that, they don't have ADHD, right? So these were just ways to kind of come up with criteria for what we're seeing. Same thing with autism, and the criteria can change over time, as it has. And so, you know, if they meet these criteria, they have autism. If they don't have autism. It's very black and white, and it's also extremely artificial and not consistent with the biology. Because you can have two kids with DUP15Q, one who meets those criteria that the psychiatrist said this is autism, and another child with DUP15Q, very same duplication, who's just shy of it. Maybe has some autistic features, but doesn't really meet the criteria. They don't have autism. Very black and white. So that black and whiteness in psychiatry, and not to be too critical of psychiatry, basically it's all we had. What we're now realizing, it's completely inconsistent with the underlying biology, and that's where psychiatry is going. We're in the middle of a huge sea change in psychiatry right now as they realize, oh my goodness, all these categorical diagnoses, you know, the genetics is kind of overlapping with all of them and telling us something different.
Do you see, I'm curious about this, you're calling it a psychiatric diagnosis, but our psychologists, child psychologists made the DSM diagnosis of autism. Do you see that frequently?
Yes, a psychologist can make an autism diagnosis. The DSM is used by psychologists, developmental pediatricians, psychiatrists. It's not just psychiatry that uses it. It's actually the Bible of how to diagnose these psychiatric conditions. I'll go through the features of autism, actually. There's certain criteria that you have to have. But again, you know, it's all we had. However, please take with a grain of salt, you know. It's like if you have two kids with a viral infection, one may have a sore throat and an earache, the other one may have a high fever and a cough, and they both have the same viral infection, right? And it's how we categorize those that's kind of just looking far removed from the underlying cause. They're not diagnosed using laboratory tests. There's no lab test for autism. There's no lab test for intellectual disability. There's no lab test for schizophrenia. There's no imaging test to look at someone's brain that says, oh, this one has autism, this doesn't. No imaging test that'll tell you this person has schizophrenia, this person doesn't. Because it's behaviorally based. Let me go with...
When my daughter died, I donated her brain to the autism tissue study at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
To know if, number one, whether they came with any conclusion, and you say that everyone with DUP15Q also has symptoms of autism.
So two questions. One has to do with, you know, did the autism brain study that was done up through Harvard in the past where they were looking at brains after people were deceased, did they come to any specific conclusions? Not any conclusion that we could say all people with DUP15 have this, that, or the other. So no specific conclusions, a lot of non-specific stuff. And the second question has to do with, do all people with DUP15 have autism? Well, no, because most people with DUP15Q will have a lot of features of autism, but some may not have enough to be described as having autism. They may not, it's an artificial sort of characterization. So not everybody with DUP15Q will meet criteria for autism, and then the criteria has changed over time. So maybe they meet, more of them meet criteria now than they did before the DSM changed in 2013.
So with an autism, our daughter has autistic-like, so they put her in the spectrum, so they say autism spectrum, like you said, that you're always now versus just the autism.
So the question is about autism spectrum versus autism. There is no just autism now. Since 2013, what we have is the autism spectrum disorder. It's one disorder and it has wide variability. In the past, there was autistic disorder as a specific, fairly severe condition, and then there were a bunch of different kind of subtypes. They have all gone away. I actually have a slide on that, so let me show you that in a bit. So here's examples of psychiatric diagnoses that are used in schools. And this is how schools kind of determine eligibility for services and placement and lots of different supports. So, you know, you'll see ASD. Intellectual disability, there's actually a definition for this in the psychiatric manual. So, you know, technically speaking, it's in the DSM-4. You can define it that way as well. I'll point out here, we've got also impulse control disorder, ADD, there's bunches of these, but something like schizophrenia, which is sort of as an adult onset condition, which it is, psychiatric condition, you know, it's another artificial divide in psychiatry. Oh, we have childhood psychiatric conditions because of their onset there, and adult psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia, psychosis, other things. It's artificial. The same genetic underpinnings may be causing the same thing in different people at different ages. Yes, there's an age of onset difference, but they're not qualitatively different. So the take-home, and this is what I want you to really take home from this talk, a behavioral diagnosis like autism or an intellectual disability or ADHD or bipolar disorder tells you what you're seeing on the outside. And as kids age, they may be showing different things on the outside. So you may not see the same behaviors in a 7-year-old as you would in a 20-year-old, for example. An etiological diagnosis, the genetic diagnosis, tells you why. So you really, I hear people saying, well, my child has Dup15q and autism, as if he's struck by two different things. He's got Dup15q, which causes his autism, and that's the way you need to think about this. They don't have two different things. They have autism because of their Dup15q, not two separate things. Now, in schools and elsewhere, when people think of genetic syndromes, they think about Down syndrome. So a lot of work has been done on this. They're really just starting to scratch the surface on so many of the other genetic diagnoses that we know about. In fact, you know, been at this a long time, and I see some familiar faces from the early days when all we had was a chromosome study that showed us this blurry extra chromosome in Dup15. Back in those days, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s even, back in the prehistory of genetic times, the diagnostic yield of a chromosome study was only about 3%. 97% of the time, as a genetic counselor, I'd be telling them, sorry, we couldn't figure it out. Now, with what's called chromosomal microarray, and again, I'll talk about these specific tests more tomorrow during the genetics testing, plus a new test that we call whole exome sequencing that's been around for a couple of years, it's at least 40% of the time we can figure out an underlying cause. Many of these causes are new disorders. We know it's causative because we know that proteins are not working properly, et cetera, but we don't know a lot about them. Dup15 is not as well known as Down syndrome, but it's a lot better known than some of these much newer ones that have only been diagnosed in the last 10 years or so. So to my point before about, you know, diagnoses, the older a person gets with a genetic condition that causes behavioral and learning issues, the more diagnoses they may rack up. So you may have a young baby who has hypotonia or poor muscle tone, and they have a chromosomal microarray done early in the newborn period, and the child gets diagnosed with Dup15q syndrome, and then maybe a little later they might have some seizures and get diagnosed with epilepsy. Later on, as they enter school age, somebody may do IQ testing and find out that they have an intellectual disability. They may have behaviors that go along with autism. They may end up needing medication or accommodations for ADHD or attentional problems, and then maybe they get diagnosed later on with anxiety. Again, they're anxious. They have too many diagnoses going on here. And you know, I've known parents go through this journey. You know, they're going to school, and every year a new thing is brought up, and the reaction of a parent, and she hears that her child has yet another diagnosis this year, you know, can we go for the record, is understandable. I work with a lot of adults, and you know, it's really interesting to open the chart and like look at the entire laundry list of all the diagnoses that are in there. And the psychiatrists who invented or came up with the DSM and really take part in the DSM process never intended it to be used this way. But in developmental disabilities, these diagnoses stay around and become additive, right? So if you have an adult, you may see 6 or 7 different diagnoses. And the bottom line is this person does not have 6 different things. And even professionals don't understand this. This person was not hit by lightning 6 times. This person has one thing. This person has Dup15q syndrome, which results in patterns of behavior and learning that by psychiatric and educational standards we call these other things. But it's still okay to use those. You still want to use them because it's what you see on the outside that's driving intervention and services right now, right? So don't say, oh, my child has Dup15, I don't want anything else. You need to embrace what's showing on the outside in order to get services. So I'm going to walk through autism and the criteria right now and just sort of talk a little bit about differences. So in the past, prior to 2013, parents of older children and adults may recall that the diagnosis of autism was under this group called PDD, or pervasive developmental disorders. And under there, this was the DSM-4, there were 5 different subtypes. So you had autistic disorder, which was autism, kind of classic autism. But then there was something called Asperger disorder, which many of you may know even from just the media, the portrayal of somebody who's highly intelligent, who has poor social interaction, et cetera. Well, that's a complete stereotype, but there was more to that diagnosis than just that stereotype on TV. But that was called Asperger's disorder. There was a very rare condition, very controversial, called childhood disintegrative disorder. Most people never actually saw this condition, and it's questionable whether it even exists. And then there's Rett syndrome, or Rett's disorder, which is now known to be a genetic disorder. And then everybody else who didn't meet criteria there but had a lot of kind of social interaction issues and communication issues could have fallen under PDD-NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. So as of May 2013, all of these diagnoses went away. So everybody with Asperger's was cured in May of 2013. Does not exist anymore. It all comes under ASD. So now it's under this continuum. So everything that was under there is now under this umbrella. And we call it disorder. And it's one disorder. It's not disorders. It's an autism spectrum disorder, realizing that it's got a very broad range of manifestations, right? So that's where we are today. So even if you have somebody who's extremely high functioning, who in the past we would have said, oh, that person has Asperger disorder, you don't give that diagnosis anymore. They still have ASD. Just like the person who maybe has more severe challenges cognitively, et cetera, they're all under the umbrella.
We have 3 kids, our youngest being our duper. Our boys also have a lot of genetic going on. And they're labeled with the pervasive developmental disorder. We did ADOS testing. They claim that autism is not likely. However, we have a lot of those features. Is it possible that the autism is there given that diagnosis, or is that just something that no, he doesn't have this, but he has this pervasive developmental?
Well, PDD doesn't exist anymore, so it must have happened. I mean, they shouldn't be giving it. Nobody should be giving a PDD diagnosis since 2013, right? Was that since then? Or maybe just before? Yeah, and it could be that he was diagnosed prior to the change in the DSM. But the other point is, and it's kind of all we have behaviorally, but it's not that there's a disorder and it's lurking there. It's, do you have the behaviors or do you not have the behaviors? It's really very black and white because it's an artificial description. It's like, do you have the behaviors? Do you not have the behaviors? Black and white. So you either have autism or you don't have autism. So if they said that your son does not have autism, and if it was a reliable person, then that means he doesn't have enough of the behaviors and the criteria to meet the criteria, but could have plenty of behaviors that go along with that, but just didn't meet the criteria. Again, it's a continuum, and what we know about these behavioral diagnoses like autism is you can have families that have 2 kids with the same genetic underpinning, right? And I'll pick Fragile X as an example because that often runs in a family. So you may have 2 boys with Fragile X. It's a known condition that causes ID and ASD. One boy has all the features of autism and meets criteria. The brother does not. He has an intellectual disability. He has a lot of features of autism, but he didn't meet that artificial criteria. They both have Fragile X. But one boy with autism gets to go to the special autism program, and the brother who just has the intellectual disability with some autistic features, he can't get in there. So it's very artificial. And so it really boils down to, do you have the features or do you not? It's behavioral. And what we actually know, it's a continuum. Every single one in this room has some autism features, some rigidity, some, don't even get me started on myself, we're there. But we may not squeak over that line for autism, right? It's a continuum. But in order to make it a diagnosis, you have to have a cutoff, and you have to have criteria, and that's what we say it is. Okay. So here's a criteria, and I'll go through this really quickly. But the current diagnosis of autism is a behaviorally based diagnosis. You want to go to a very good specialist. And again, I don't mean to be disparaging. It's important to define if somebody has autism or they don't. But let's call a spade here. It's a symptom diagnosis. It's not, that there's something there and it's not coming out. So the first group of symptoms has to do with deficits in social communication and interaction across multiple contexts. So you can't just be having these problems at home, but then when you're out at school and church, you're fine, right? They have to be across multiple places and kind of part of your whole day. They have problems with social and emotional reciprocity. So a mom who goes to give her child a hug, the child is either not noticing or doesn't reciprocate, and use of nonverbal communicative behaviors. So one of the earliest manifestations of autism behaviors is a child who doesn't point to things, because that shows you want to get another human being kind of involved in what you're seeing. So they're not pointing sometimes. Developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. And not every person with autism has all of these three things. So some may have autism because they have a lot of problems with nonverbal communication. Others may have more of a problem with social or emotional reciprocity. So you can meet it in a number of different ways. The second group has to do with restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So some of this has to do with motor movements, walking around on your toes and flapping your hands, for example, spinning string, those sorts of things. Some have to do with behaviors like insisting on sameness, routine, certain patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior, sometimes getting really focused on one thing and not being able to kind of break away from it, and they have to do the same thing, and it's kind of a ritual over time. And then sometimes being overly sensitive or undersensitive to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. Kids who smell things inappropriately. Kids who really seem to have a very high tolerance for pain. They're not really reacting to pain. So it can come in many different ways. And not every person with autism meets all these criteria. And then finally, the symptoms have to start in the early developmental period. That's crucial. Like up to about 3 years of age, when the child's just developing, this is when these symptoms emerge. If you have a, 15-year-old who was doing perfectly fine and then, let's say, gets a head injury and starts to show some of these behaviors, that child doesn't have autism. This is a developmental condition. That was a traumatic brain injury type of a problem, even though the symptoms may overlap. They have to cause impairment. So this is a really important one right now, because there are many people in our society who have problems with attention span, but they are able to channel that into something really productive. It doesn't impact their life, or they may have problems with social interaction, but it really doesn't impact their functioning. They've figured workarounds, et cetera. So we can't say it's a disorder if you're living your life and it's not causing you problems, right? So it's only a disorder if it makes you dysfunctional. And we also have to understand, and particularly with DUP15, I'd say sometimes with certain intellectual disabilities where people are functioning at a pretty young level. So maybe somebody who's functioning at maybe a 12 to 18-month mental age, even though they're older, they may do a lot of these things anyway, because that's what very young age people do, and that's intellectual disability that's driving the behavior, not because they have an entirely separate social interaction problem, right? Because if you're functioning at a very low cognitive level, you may not have verbal skills, you may have problems with communication. That doesn't mean you have autism. It means, that's where you are functioning cognitively. And so that's hard to tease out sometimes with DUP15, because some of our folks are functioning pretty low cognitively, and then they have a lot of different behaviors, spinning around, flapping, things like that. Is it really autism, or, that's just kind of relative to where they're functioning cognitively? Did you have a question? So the question was about the diagnosis of autism. If they're 7 or 8 years old, could they get that diagnosis later? Absolutely. It's when did the symptoms start is what I'm saying. So there are kids who get diagnosed late, you know, after school age with an autism diagnosis. And it's like, oh yeah, talking to the parents, these behaviors were present from they were young, but nobody picked it up. So there's a difference. I'm talking about the kids who are developing typically, nobody's noticing anything wrong, even the families, and then something happens and they start to have changes. That's different. This is not something early on. And then with the new DSM, it's not that new anymore, but they kind of break it down into different levels of support. So you may see that, you know, this is an autism spectrum disorder, requires very substantial support. And so that's helpful because that lets you know kind of for eligibility for services what you should be looking at. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through the definition of intellectual disability. So this is a scary one, particularly for parents of young kids, because it's that horrible term, mental retardation, that was around for many decades, and this is what we call it now, ID, or intellectual disability. In fact, before mental retardation, it was called mental impairment, and prior to that, there were a number of other terms that kind of gave way. And what happens with this disability is, over time, in our society, and in every society, not just in the US, it becomes stigmatizing. And kids make fun of you when you have brain disorders. And you know what's interesting? In every culture in the world, that's true. People make fun and tease individuals who have brain disorders. It's just there's nothing different about the brain from any other organ, but you don't hear kids teasing other people who have heart disease or things like that. But the brain and every single society is one of the things about humans. We pick on those who have brain disorders. And so they keep changing the name of this every few decades after it becomes pejorative. Mental retardation was considered a very strong scientific term that people were using, didn't have any negative connotations at all in the past, and then over a number of decades, it became this terrible name, and they changed it to intellectual disability. No question. Probably in my lifetime, we're going to change ID again. It'll be some other name. Maybe they'll go back to some of the earlier names, because they're going to start running out of names. So what is ID? Well, ID, again, is sort of an artificial term in the sense that it's not a biological idea. It's something that is defined because, and this is important, as a society, we need to figure out who are the 1 to 3% of our population who are so vulnerable that they need extra supports, extra special education, et cetera. So it's an eligibility criterion. It's a social construct. I mean, it doesn't exist in biology. What it means is intellectual disability is based on how do we define that percentage of our population who are going to need extra help in school, who are going to need extra supports and a safety net. That's all. That's why ID exists. And there are 3 criteria for ID. Deficits in intellectual functioning, so an IQ of 70 or below, and then deficits in adaptive functioning. So it's not enough to say a person has a lower IQ. This person also has to have problems in how they navigate their environment and live their lives, so communication problems, social skills, et cetera. And then finally, this has to happen up to age 18, so prior to age 18. And those are the criteria. They're very artificial. And if you apply these, you can say, okay, 1 to 3% of the population in the United States has an intellectual disability. 97, 99% of the people do not have that. So it's really a social diagnosis. It's important because it makes you eligible for services as a child and adult. But in terms of driving treatment, think of all the people who have intellectual disability from extremely mild to extremely severe. Like, it doesn't give you any clue about what you're supposed to do. It's an eligibility diagnosis. I'll point out 2 very artificial things about intellectual disability. And one has to do with the age cutoff. The cutoff is 18. So if you have a child who meets those criteria before the age of 18, they can have intellectual disability. Imagine you have a 17-year-old and it's a week before his 18th birthday, typically developing, doing his senior year in high school, is going down the road and gets into a car accident and ends up with a brain injury and ends up with an IQ under 70, problems with adaptive functioning. By that definition, he has intellectual disability, and then he is eligible for all the services for people with intellectual disability. Imagine that same teenager, a month after his 18th birthday, gets into the same car accident ends up with the same deficits in adaptive behavior and an IQ under 70. He doesn't have ID. He has traumatic brain injury. Totally different funding stream in our society. He doesn't have the same types of sort of safety net that a person with ID would have. So it's artificial. We need it because we need to figure out who is. But I often talk with parents who, at the age of 5, they go to school and their child maybe comes out with a intellectual disability diagnosis. And before that, it was developmental delay, which is kind of soft and gentle. And then the child gets diagnosed with ID. And it's like the world has fallen in, and I completely sympathize and understand, but your child has not changed one bit. Your child, before he went to school that day, also had intellectual disability. So yes, take your moment and your breath to take that in, but nothing's really changed. Your child's still your child. These are ways to sort of categorize what we see on the outside. The other thing that's artificial about ID is it's based on an IQ score. So here's the bell curve of IQs in the United States, and then based on IQs, there's a little bump down at the end that's not to scale, that's individuals who have very severe to profound intellectual disabilities. But the average IQ in the United States is 100, and there's a reason it's 100. It's because we say so. Because that's the way the tests are made. The average is always 100. So if the people in the US get smarter, they're going to have to make the questions harder. It's always got to be 100. It's nothing special about people that the average IQ is 100, right? I wonder about the average IQ of the United States these days. But anyway, the cutoff of 70 is decided arbitrarily. It's 30 points below the average of 100, and it was decided that under 70 is 1 to 3% of the population, and that's going to be the cutoff for intellectual disability. Look on the other side, that's 30 points above is the artificial cutoff for gifted, right? And so, the parents who are all puffed up, my child's gifted, they're set. And then the parents who find out that their child has an IQ of 124 and they're not gifted, they're all crestfallen. There's not a lot of a difference between 124 and 131, but there's a cutoff, just like there is for ID. So what's important is that's subject to change. And in fact, in the 1970s, where there's a lot of money available for social services, the cutoff for mental retardation or mental impairment at the time was actually 85, because there was a lot of money available for Head Start and other services. So at that point, 16% of the US population had a diagnosis of intellectual disability. 16% of the population met criteria for mental retardation. And then after a couple of years, they decided that cost way too much money, and so they dropped it back down to 70. And when they did that, the powers that be who decide on these kind of diagnoses, when they did that, overnight, millions of people were cured of mental retardation. They woke up in the morning and they didn't have it anymore. So it's artificial. It's important because it identifies people who need help, but it doesn't change anything about your child, one with or without ID. And it's important to know that. So finally, there's a lot of diagnostic confusion. These terms get thrown about all over the place. Autism's a big one. People just don't understand how autism fits in. It's a symptom constellation. Dup15 is a cause. We know that psychiatric and behavioral symptoms are found in association with many genetic disorders, not just Dup15q. There's hundreds and hundreds of them that have these profiles that affect behavior and learning. It's important for parents, but also professionals, to understand the distinction. There are many professionals out there who don't understand the difference between why a child has two diagnoses, autism versus Dup15, for example. Educational and behavioral diagnoses are really the ones that are going to drive treatment and eligibility for services, so please do not turn your backs on those. If it correctly describes your child, it's accurate and it's important. So individuals with Dup15q are going to meet criteria for at least one, sometimes many more. Very often they'll meet criteria for an intellectual disability, they meet criteria for ADHD, attention problems, particularly when they're young. They often meet criteria for an autism spectrum disorder. So right there, you've got constellations of behaviors that can be defined. And you want to use those diagnoses for everything they're worth. And it's hard, because you're like, oh my gosh, but realize your child doesn't have a bunch of different things. Your child has one thing, and these are ways to describe the needs. Schools and teachers are usually not familiar with Dup15q syndrome. No surprise there, it was true 30 years ago, it's true today. But this doesn't mean they can't provide great services. If you've got a school that's really got a great autism program, your kid is thriving, for goodness sake, I don't care that they don't know what Dup15q syndrome is if they're really meeting the needs. An open mind, a willingness to learn about Dup15, and then a creative approach is what you're looking for. Now, I hear from parents all the time saying, oh, I'm so disappointed. We went to my child's school. They don't know anything about Dup15. Is there a place we should move? I've actually had parents say that, Where are the best schools in the country for Dup15? What you want to go for are the symptoms, just like any other parent. The Dup15 is really important for a number of reasons. And you want to keep your ear to the ground if interventions start to come about that say, wow, this really works for kids with Dup15. You want to make sure those teachers are listening and trying to adapt it in. But don't go trying to chase schools. I would rather have a teacher who never heard of Dup15 but was really willing to learn and understand versus one who says, oh yeah, I know all about that disorder, and really doesn't have, isn't really integrating that knowledge. So I just want to acknowledge my colleagues. We're doing some research, as I mentioned, out here, and we have one of the 9 Dup15q clinics, and they're always packed, and I'm always really happy to see our families come there. So thank you very much. And I'll be around also at the whole conference. I don't want to run behind too much, but I can answer questions later as well.